She was 24, 6 months pregnant, and headed home on a quiet train through the Colorado mountains. The last known photo shows her in a dining car, smiling softly, a slice of pie untouched before her. Somewhere between Glenwood Springs and Denver, she vanished. No signs of struggle, no open doors, just a warm seat and a silence no one could explain. For 13 years, her name faded until a hiker, lost in the woods, stumbled on something buried beneath the snow, and a secret the forest had been keeping all this time. The camera lingers, just long enough to haunt. A grainy photograph floats into view, colors muted, time-stained, flickering as though caught between memory and dream. A young woman sits by a train window, golden afternoon light slanting across her face. Her smile is quiet, almost shy, as if unsure whether she deserves to feel content. One hand rests protectively on her swollen belly, the other idly nudging a fork through a half-eaten slice of cherry pie. Her waitress uniform is neatly pressed, name tag gleaming faintly beneath the overhead lights. Emily, it reads. Just that, just Emily. The train hums with motion, the world outside nothing but trees blurring into streaks of green and gray. Mountains rise in the distance, stoic and ancient, watching everything and nothing at once. Her eyes aren't fixed on the scenery, though they're turned inward, drifting through thoughts no one else could possibly access. Before we go deeper into the chilling mystery of Emily Marlowe, the pregnant waitress who vanished without a trace on a moving train, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue uncovering the stories that time tried to erase. Every subscription allows us to bring more voices like Emily's back into the light. It's a small gesture for you, but it means the world to these forgotten names. Thank you. Hope, fear, the low, constant murmur of a future still forming. A mother waiting to be. You can almost hear the clink of dishes behind her, the distant laugh of another passenger, the soft announcement muffled by the intercom. Next stop, Granby. But this moment feels suspended, oddly isolated, as if time itself decided to hold its breath. And then, a voice low, solemn, detached from any visible mouth floats in like mist through a broken window pane. She never made it home. A shiver runs beneath the narration, the kind that settles in your bones before your mind understands why. The image lingers for a second more. Her smile, her eyes, the flicker of movement just outside the train window. Then, static. The photo warps. The sound of wind rises, unmoored and mournful. There are no sirens, no screams, no blood on the floor, just absence. A space that once held a life now echoes with unanswered questions. Somewhere, a clock ticks too loudly. Somewhere, a mother waits by a phone that will never ring. Somewhere, a name is whispered in a sleep-drenched plea by someone who doesn't remember why it hurts so much to say it. What do we remember when someone vanishes? A gesture, a smile, the color of their coat. How they asked for extra whipped cream, even though they always said they wouldn't. Little things, the kind that gather dust in the corners of your mind until they're all that's left. That's how Emily Marlowe lived, in the margins of memory, frozen in a single moment. A smile in the dining car. A waitress on her day off, heading somewhere she believed was safe. The train rolled on steel, indifferent to its cargo. No alarms were raised. No footsteps chased shadows down narrow aisles. Just one more stop missed, one more seat empty. She was 6 months pregnant. She was tired. She was kind. That's what they said afterward. That's what they always say. But there was something else in that photo. Something not easily seen but deeply felt. A flicker behind her eyes. A knowing. As if, somehow, Emily sensed the train would carry her not toward reunion or rest, but toward silence, toward forgetting. And yet there she is, still, smiling softly beneath flickering light, hand over belly, waiting for a future that never came. The wind moved low through the pines that morning, whispering across a silent stretch of Colorado wilderness. It was the kind of cold that bit through gloves, the kind that settled deep in your chest and stayed there. Snow clung to the forest floor in patchy, brittle sheets, softening the crunch of boots but not quite masking it. The hiker, mid-40s, solitary by nature, had wandered off the marked trail hours ago, drawn more by instinct than intention. He liked the quiet, the remoteness. Out here, the world didn't press in so hard. He paused near a cluster of bent aspens, their white bark peeling like sunburned skin, and leaned down to adjust his laces. That's when he saw it. Just a glint at first metal, catching what little light made it through the clouded canopy. Half buried in crusted snow, tucked against the exposed roots of a tree, there was something man-made. He brushed at it with gloved fingers. A rectangular shape, rusted edges. He picked it up carefully, like it might crumble in his hands. It was a name tag. The kind you might see on a diner uniform. The surface was worn, smeared by time and weather, but the letters were still legible. Emily. He didn't recognize the name. Not at first, not consciously. But something about it pressed at him like a dream half remembered after waking. He turned the tag over. The metal back was corroded, pin clasp broken. There was a thin smear of something dark, old, maybe mud, maybe something else. He stood there longer than he meant to, staring at it, feeling the weight of it grow heavier by the second. Later, when he made his way back down and told a ranger what he'd found, he was met with a long silence. The ranger asked for the name again, more carefully this time. Emily. Emily Marlowe. There was a moment, a tightening in the man's eyes that suggested recognition, the kind that doesn't come with joy. It had been 13 years. 13 years since a young woman vanished from a train, less than 20 miles from where that name tag was found. She was pregnant. She was never seen again. The story had circulated briefly back then. A few headlines, a cold trail, a grieving family clinging to air. But time does what it always does, it moves on, dragging the rest of the world with it. To most, her name was forgotten, just another missing person among thousands. But in these mountains, where silence holds memory better than people do, her story still echoed. A waitress, a train, a tunnel, a vanished life. And now, this, a single name, peeking out from under the snow like a whisper from the earth itself. The tag was turned over to authorities. The coordinates were marked. Investigators returned to the forest, some for the first time in over a decade. No one said it out loud, but they all felt the same thing. The air had shifted. Something buried was waking up. Ghosts don't stay gone forever, not in places like this. Before the news clippings, before the missing posters, before her face faded into a cautionary tale, whispered by strangers, Emily Marlowe was simply a young woman trying to hold her life together with both hands. She was 24, barely, though she looked younger on tired days and older when she wore worry-like makeup. A waitress at a roadside diner called June's Junction, where the floors squeaked and the jukebox only played if you hit it just right. Emily worked the morning shift and sometimes stayed through dinner, pulling doubles not because she loved the work, but because saving for a baby on tips and refills didn't leave much choice. She wore her uniform like armor, crisp collar, name tag always straight, hair tied back in a practical bun, flyaways smoothed with the back of her hand when no one was looking. 6 months pregnant and still balancing trays with the ease of someone used to carrying weight no one else could see. She lived in a small rental above the old hardware store in Glenwood Springs, a second-story walk-up with thin walls and a view of the alley. Her apartment smelled faintly of lavender and cheap coffee, and on her windowsill sat a wilting succulent she named Presley, after the king. Elvis was her weakness. His ballads played low on the radio during quiet mornings, her favorite being Can't Help Falling in Love. She never said who she thought about when it played. Emily didn't have many friends. She was friendly, but not open. The kind of person who remembered birthdays and always left the last slice of pie for someone else, but rarely shared her own stories, not fully. Not in ways that left her vulnerable. Those who knew her described her as sweet, a hard worker, and always polite. But if you looked closer, you'd see something more layered. A woman navigating survival. A woman who had dreams, once. She carried a worn leather notebook in her purse. Spiral-bound, soft from handling, the cover etched with little drawings and half-rubbed-out stars. Inside were sketches, some of faces mostly women, often staring off into space. Others of trains, old buildings, constellations drawn in blue ink. Sometimes she wrote things down. Quotes, hopes. Names scratched out and replaced with better ones. In the back, a few folded papers, a list of baby names, a bus schedule, an ultrasound photo dated 3 weeks before her disappearance. A note in cursive said simply, 22 weeks, strong heartbeat. She'd been planning something. That much was clear, though no one knew exactly what. A visit to her sister in Denver. A break from the monotony. Maybe more. Some speculated she was running from someone. Others believed she was running toward something. But the Emily who boarded that train was not running. She was moving forward, slowly, cautiously, like someone learning to trust her future again. Her life wasn't perfect, not by any stretch. But she was trying. That notebook, those sketches, they told the truth of someone not yet ready to give up. Who was Emily Marlowe? She was a daughter, a sister, a waitress, an expectant mother with a drawer full of baby socks and a heart bigger than the town she lived in. A woman not defined by her vanishing, but by every small thing she left behind. Cherry cola in a paper cup. A faint hum of Elvis beneath her breath. And a notebook filled with the kind of dreams that don't just disappear. The train left Glenwood Springs just after 7:30 inches the morning, a long silver line cutting through the frost-covered rails like a scalpel through old scars. It was early spring, that in-between season, where winter still loiters in the corners and the thaw hasn't yet begun to feel like a promise. Emily Marlowe boarded the coach car near the rear, carrying a small overnight bag, a paper sack of food from the diner, and her ever-present notebook. She wore a dark green coat that swallowed her frame and buttoned awkwardly over her pregnant belly. Witnesses later recalled her smiling at the conductor, saying thank you, as she tucked her ticket into her coat pocket, as if good manners might ward off whatever unease lay ahead. It was supposed to be a simple ride. Just over 200 miles, Glenwood Springs to Denver. A winding journey through some of Colorado's most breathtaking terrain, jagged cliffs, winding canyons, endless stretches of snow-draped pine. Emily had made the trip before, more than once, but this time felt different. She was 6 months pregnant, tired, quiet. According to one passenger, she stared out the window almost the entire ride, barely touching her food. Around 11:15 a.m. The train entered Moffat Tunnel, a 6-mile stretch of darkness carved through the Rocky Mountains. Cell signals died here, radios crackled into silence, and the air took on a thick, pressing stillness. Some writers joked about it, about the way sound dropped away, and time seemed to fold in on itself. But others, especially those who rode, often spoke of it differently. As if the tunnel wasn't just a passage, but a kind of threshold. Moments before the train entered the tunnel, Emily's phone pinged a cell tower outside Winter Park, a single location mark. That would be the last time her phone connected to anything. After that, there was nothing. No outgoing calls, no texts, no social media activity. When the train emerged into daylight minutes later, she was no longer in her seat. The conductor didn't notice until much later. No alarm was raised. No frantic search commenced. It was only after the train reached Union Station in Denver and her sister waited alone by the arrivals gate for an hour, then 2, that anyone began to wonder where Emily was. Security footage was limited. A camera at Glenwood Springs captured her boarding. A blurry angle inside the car showed her seated, briefly, coat bundled tight, eyes lowered. But the footage from later in the trip was missing. Glitched. A hardware failure, they said. It happens, they said. No one remembered her getting off. No staff saw her move through the narrow halls. No passengers reported hearing a struggle. Just gone. The seat she'd been in was still warm when checked. Her paper lunch sat half-eaten on the tray. Her notebook, usually close to her, was not found. Some thought she must have slipped off at one of the stops. But there were only a few, and none accounted for a woman 6 months pregnant, vanishing without a word, without even her bag. Others whispered darker things. Things about the tunnel. About the way it swallows time. What we know is this: a train left Glenwood Springs with Emily Marlowe on board. It arrived in Denver without her. And somewhere between those 2 points, in the hush of that long, dark tunnel, the world lost track of her. The voice doesn't come all at once. It arrives slowly, as if hesitant to break the silence. Soft, brittle. Like paper left too long in the sundae. A woman's voice, older now, lined with years that shouldn't have been this heavy. "You keep setting her place at the table," she says. "Just in case." The words hang there, not as a statement but as a ritual, spoken aloud for no one in particular. For a ghost, maybe. Or for the echo of a daughter who should have come home. Her name is Margaret Marlowe, though everyone in Glenwood Springs calls her Maggie. A woman who once sold antiques out of a storefront no one visits anymore. A mother who has aged in strange, uneven ways. Her hair turned gray too fast. Her hands shake a little when they hold photographs, but her eyes, they haven't dulled. They're watchful, tired, but not empty. The kind of tired that comes from waiting for a door to open that never does. When Emily disappeared, Maggie was the first to know something was wrong. It wasn't just a missed call. It was the silence that came afterward. It wasn't like her daughter to vanish into air. She had called the night before her train ride, saying she was bringing baby clothes to show her sister. "They've got tiny peaches on them," she'd said, laughing softly. Maggie had smiled, listening, closing her eyes, imagining the sound of her daughter's voice bouncing off nursery walls that hadn't been painted yet. When the hours passed and no word came, Maggie called the police, then the train station, then the hospitals, then the police again. Her voice grew more desperate with each call, but the answers stayed the same. No sign, no report, no incident. No body, they reminded her. As if that made it better. So she printed flyers, dozens at first, then hundreds. A photo of Emily smiling next to a stack of pancakes. Her waitress uniform slightly stained with syrup. "Missing," the bold letters read. "Last seen boarding a train to Denver." She taped them to lampposts, gas pumps, bathroom stalls, bus stops, diner windows. Some were ripped down. Others faded until the ink ran like tears down the paper. People helped in the beginning. They brought meals, left candles. Volunteers came together for searches through the outskirts of town, but days turned into weeks, weeks into months. And slowly, the attention shifted. The world moved on. Because that's what it does. It forgets, gently at first, then completely. But not Maggie. Her home is a time capsule. Emily's room still holds the same furniture, the same sheets, the same books on the shelf, dog-eared and underlined. A small crib, never used, sits in the corner beneath a blanket. Maggie crocheted the week before the due date that never arrived. She doesn't go in often. But when she does, she talks to the room like it's listening. "Dinner's at 6, she'll whisper. "We're having roast and potatoes, your favorite." Sometimes, she sets a place for Emily. A plate, a glass, a folded napkin beside a chair no one dares touch. When asked why, Maggie never hesitates. You don't stop being a mother, she says, even when there's no one left to mother. Her voice returns again near the end, quiet, almost lost beneath the sound of wind moving through empty rooms. I still call her name, you know, not every day, but sometimes, just to see if the house remembers. She pauses, just in case. In the days following Emily's disappearance, investigators worked their way through the manifest, calling each passenger listed on the train that morning. One by one, they left voicemails, rang doorbells, waited in lobbies with clipboards and questions that felt heavier than they should have been. Most riders remembered nothing: a nap, a crossword puzzle, the changing landscape through frost-flecked glass, but a few had details. Small ones, slippery ones, and none of them quite matched. A middle-aged man, Harold Brenner, swore he saw Emily near the dining car around 10:30. He said she was laughing, really laughing, with one of the conductors. She had her hand on her belly, he recalled. The kind of laugh you feel down to your bones. He remembered it because it seemed out of place. The dining car was nearly empty, no music played. But there she was, head tilted back, eyes bright. Like the world outside the window didn't exist. He couldn't remember the conductor's name, only that he wore a navy cap and carried a thermos that smelled of peppermint tea. But another passenger, a woman named Leanne Moretti, offered a different memory entirely. She claimed Emily looked tense, withdrawn, she said. She kept checking her phone, like she was waiting for a message she didn't want to get. Leanne said she last saw Emily walking down the narrow aisle between cars, toward the restrooms. She watched her pass by, one hand trailing along the edge of the seats, the other gripping the strap of her bag like it might float away. She never came back, Leanne said. At least, I didn't see her again. A young couple seated a few rows behind Emily told police they barely noticed her at all. She seemed tired, the woman said. I thought she was sleeping. Her partner added that he remembered hearing someone humming. Maybe her. Maybe someone else. One man claimed to have seen her speaking with a tall stranger by the luggage rack between cars. But when pressed for details, clothing, height, voice, his story unraveled. Maybe it wasn't her, he conceded. It was all a blur. Even the staff couldn't agree. One attendant remembered punching her ticket near Granby. Another insisted Emily was no longer in her seat when he passed through shortly after. The conductor Harold mentioned couldn't be located. Transferred, retired, maybe something else. The records were unclear. Then there were the cameras installed in select cars for safety, part of a new federal mandate rolled out just months earlier. But on this particular ride, 2 of the 3 had malfunctioned. One lost its feed entirely during the tunnel stretch. The other recorded hours of static, as though someone had erased time frame by frame. The train doors had remained closed between stops, sealed from the inside. Conductors confirmed no unauthorized openings. Emergency levers were untouched. No passengers disembarked where they shouldn't have. According to the system logs, everything was normal. Except it wasn't. Somewhere between what was seen and what was said, the truth frayed. Threads pulled loose, stories that should have overlapped, diverged. Laughter or silence, restroom or dining car. Alone or with company. Emily became a mirror different to every person who looked at her, never the same reflection twice. In the end, the only certainty was absence. She boarded the train, that much is known. After that, every version of her splinters, ghost-like. Conflicting images trapped in the mind's eye, flickering in and out like a light struggling to stay on. And yet, no one remembers hearing a scream. The train that carried Emily Marlowe from Glenwood Springs to Denver followed a route carved through both beauty and isolation. It traced the curves of the Colorado River, passed under the shadow of mountain peaks, and threaded its way through stretches of wilderness so remote they seemed untouched by time. For passengers, it was often described as one of the most scenic rides in the country. But for investigators retracing Emily's steps, it became a map of silence, each bend, each tunnel, a question with no answer. The journey begins with open country. Meadows and foothills stretch out like calm waters before the storm. Then, the terrain begins to rise. The train moves through canyons, rock faces pressing in on either side, trees growing in tight clusters where the sun can barely reach. Between stops at Rifle, Glenwood Springs, and Granby, the train remains in contact with signal towers, the hum of cellular life flickering on and off in predictable rhythm. But as the train climbs higher toward the Continental Divide, everything begins to fall away: phone service, radio signals, even time itself. Around mile marker 112, the train reaches its most remote point. Here, surrounded by towering pines and steep drops that vanish into snow-packed ravines, lies the Moffat Tunnel. 6 miles long, nearly 10 minutes of darkness. It is the longest tunnel on the route and the point at which all signals die. A dead zone by every measure: electronic, visual, even emotional. Passengers often describe it as disorienting, the sudden loss of light and sound, like slipping into a dream they weren't prepared to enter. Time slows there. Minutes stretch, uncooperative and strange. Some try to pass the time with games on their phones, only to be greeted by blank screens. Others sit in stillness, counting the seconds until the light returns. It was in this tunnel that the timeline broke. The last confirmed ping from Emily's phone came just before the train entered the tunnel's mouth, outside Winter Park. After that, nothing. No more signals, no confirmed sightings, no movement. Reconstruction efforts were meticulous. Investigators examined timestamps, car assignments, mechanical logs. They ran simulations, tracing every inch of the train's layout, mapping where she could have moved, where she couldn't have. But there was no evidence of foul play, no sign of forced entry or tampered doors. Just one woman, 24 years old, pregnant, disappearing inside a sealed vehicle, moving at 35 miles per hour through solid rock. Some investigators believed she had planned to vanish, that she used the tunnel's blind spot to slip away, though no one could explain how. Others thought she was taken, but again, no one saw anyone suspicious. No one heard anything unusual. No alarms, no disruptions. Just the train, rumbling forward, steady and indifferent. To passengers, it was a routine ride. To those who would search for her later, it became something else entirely. A fracture in the fabric of narrative. A place where logic and reality lost their footing. The vanishing point. The tunnel still exists, still carries trains and tourists, still wears the years like an old scar. But for those who remember, for those who care to look closely, it is more than a passage through stone. It is a wound long, dark, and echoing, where a young woman vanished without a trace, and the world kept going, as if she had never been there at all. The search for Emily Marlowe began not with urgency, but with hesitation. By the time authorities were officially notified, nearly 48 hours had passed since her train was supposed to arrive in Denver. Her sister had waited at the station long after the other passengers had gone. She paced, made calls, asked at the front desk. They told her the train had no reported incidents, no medical emergencies, no police interventions. It had arrived without delay. According to the system, nothing had gone wrong. But something had. When her family contacted the local police, they were met with quiet skepticism. The kind reserved for adults who go missing without obvious cause. Maybe she got off early, one officer suggested. Maybe she changed her mind. Pregnant women sometimes experience emotional distress. The implication was soft, but cruel. That Emily, in the midst of her 3rd trimester, had simply wandered away from her life without telling anyone. No signs of violence, no notes, no footprints in the snow, just absence. Still, a search was opened, though limited in scope and even more limited in time. A sweep of the train was conducted once it was back in Glenwood Springs. Her assigned seat was empty, her ticket logged as used. A partially eaten sandwich in a paper wrapper was recovered, but there were no fingerprints except her own, no personal belongings left behind. Her small overnight bag was never found. Authorities questioned the train staff, canvassed passengers, and reviewed what little surveillance footage existed. But the investigation stalled almost immediately. The malfunctioning cameras were chalked up to outdated hardware. The conductor mentioned in the witness statements was never officially identified. The dark stretch of tunnel became a convenient metaphor, something to blame when answers couldn't be found. A ghost in the system, one officer said, almost joking. After 2 weeks, the efforts scaled down. The terrain near the Moffat Tunnel was difficult to search in early spring. Snow still clung to the slopes, and the cliffs were unstable. A search dog team was brought in, but weather conditions limited their range. No items were recovered. No clothing, no blood, no phone, not even a footprint in the slush. Just trees, and wind, and a silence that seemed to stretch in every direction. With no physical evidence and no criminal indicators, the case was quietly reclassified. Missing adult, non-suspicious circumstances. It meant fewer resources. No dedicated task force. No leads to follow. In the months that followed, it was moved into the cold case file. A folder, stamped and sealed, placed among hundreds of others just like it. Emily's name became a line in a database. Her face faded from bulletin boards. The flyers curled at the edges and disappeared with the wind. The search ended not with closure but with fatigue. No one said it directly, but the message was clear. People disappear. Especially women with problems no one wants to name. And so, the case closed not because the truth was found, but because it was easier to stop asking. Easier to believe she walked away than to admit the world might have taken her without leaving a trace. But the file still exists, still gathers dust in a drawer marked cold cases. And somewhere, buried between the silence and the snow, so does the truth. 10 years after Emily Marlowe disappeared, the town had mostly let her name slip from memory. People still took the train. They still admired the view. They still passed by the old diner where she once worked, unaware of the weight that space used to carry. June's Junction had changed hands 3 times since then, repainted and renamed, but some nights when the neon flickered just right, it still looked like the place she'd left behind. The place that never saw her return. It was around this time that a local blogger named Daniel Rhodes stumbled across her story in a digitized police archive. Daniel wasn't an investigator or a journalist by trade. He ran a blog called Lost Tracks, a side project born from boredom and a fascination with stories that never found endings. He specialized in the forgotten, the missing, the unresolved, the names no one whispered anymore. Emily's case began as just another file. He almost passed it over, but the details lingered. A pregnant waitress, vanishing during a routine train ride with no witnesses, no evidence, no body. The case felt off, not just cold, but unfinished, like a story cut mid-sentence. And so, Daniel began to dig. He started with public records. He found the police statements, the conflicting witness accounts, the malfunctioning camera logs, the eerie coincidence of the tunnel, a perfect blackout window where time seemed to bend. He requested interviews with the original investigators. Most declined. A few didn't respond. One agreed to speak under the condition of anonymity. It was like she evaporated, the man told him. We had nothing. That's what people don't get. Sometimes it's not incompetence. Sometimes the trail just isn't there. Daniel published his first piece in early spring, exactly 10 years to the day of Emily's disappearance. He titled it, "The Waitress Who Vanished into Smoke." The post described her life in careful, human terms, who she was, not just how she disappeared. It resonated in ways Daniel didn't expect. The blog, once a quiet corner of the internet, began drawing readers. Comments flooded in. People shared theories, personal experiences, stories of other missing women from the same region, some decades apart. Some believed Emily had planned her disappearance, that she'd staged the whole thing, maybe to escape an abusive partner, maybe to start over. Others thought she'd had a breakdown, walked into the woods, and succumbed to the elements. But one theory began to take shape in the comment sections and late-night threads, that someone on that train knew her well enough to coax her into trust, knew the tunnel's timing, knew how to make someone vanish without leaving a mess. The blog post was shared across forums, true crime communities, even caught the attention of a local podcaster who dedicated an episode to her case. Her name was spoken again, her face posted beside more current headlines. And just like that, Emily Marlowe was no longer lost to time. She wasn't solved, but she was seen. Daniel's posts continued, diving deeper into inconsistencies. Ticket logs, missing employee records. A conductor who quietly left the company months after the incident. A repair report for the very cameras that failed that day signed by someone who'd since vanished from all digital traces. Details that felt more like whispers than proof. It was speculation, hazy, maybe. But it reopened something. A wound, a memory. A quiet question that still demanded an answer. How does a person disappear on a moving train without a single scream? She may have been forgotten by systems, by protocol, by time. But not by everyone. Not anymore. The forest was colder than anyone expected that morning, though the calendar promised spring. The hiker stood quietly, half wrapped in a windbreaker too thin for the chill, eyes fixed on the spot beneath a crooked pine. He didn't say much as the investigators arrived, just nodded, pointed, and stepped back like he'd stumbled into something holy or cursed, maybe both. They approached slowly, unsure what they'd find, unsure what they wanted to find. What waited beneath the brittle crust of frost wasn't a body, not in the way they feared, but it was something. Proof that Emily Marlowe had come this way, that she had not been a ghost after all. The first thing they uncovered was the name tag, half buried in pine needles and thin soil. Its surface dulled by rust and time, the letters still visible beneath a smear of grime. Emily. No last name. Just the first. Like someone had worn it every day until the world stopped asking who she was. A few feet away, tangled in a gnarled tangle of roots, they found a scrap of fabric faded green, possibly once a coat. The edges were frayed, chewed by time or teeth, no way to tell. There was something strangely intimate about the piece, as though it had once carried warmth. They handled it carefully, gloves brushing away years of decay as they laid it into an evidence bag. Then came the phone, or what was left of it. Cracked, screen shattered into a spiderweb of nothing, its casing warped by moisture and cold. The logo was long faded, but they could still tell it was a model from over a decade ago, now obsolete. They wouldn't know for days, maybe weeks, if anything could be recovered from its memory. But even silent, the phone spoke. It said she had been here. It said she had tried, maybe, to reach someone. To hold on to a thread of connection, even as the dark crept in. But it was the chain that stopped them. A delicate thing, rusted nearly through, resting at the base of a stone, like it had been placed there deliberately. At the end of it, a small metal bird no bigger than a coin. A sparrow, wings tucked in, head tilted. The kind of charm you might buy from a tourist shop or receive as a gift without much thought. But there was something about it, something childlike, something precious. One of the investigators recognized it from the original case photos. Emily had worn it often. Her mother had mentioned it once in an interview, saying she'd given it to her daughter for protection when she first left home. To remind her she could always fly back. They stood in silence after that, the only sound the wind threading its way through the pine branches. The forest had held its secrets well, layers of snow, seasons of silence, the indifference of time. Whatever had happened here had not wanted to be found. And yet, here it was. Not a full truth, but fragments, echoes, enough to suggest a story buried in soil and ice, enough to reopen the questions everyone had tried to forget. The hiker watched from a distance, arms crossed, face unreadable. He had only come out for the view. He had not expected to find a ghost folded into the woods. But the forest never forgets. It only waits. The lab results came back under gray skies. A quiet email, clinical in tone, detached in delivery, bearing the weight of a decade-old grief. The bone fragments, the hair caught in fabric fibers, the skin cells preserved by cold, there was no question. The remains found near the cabin in the woods belonged to Emily Marlowe. After 13 years of silence, the confirmation should have brought answers. Instead, it only deepened the mystery. The location alone raised questions. The cabin, weathered and rotting into the hillside, lay 5 miles from the nearest hiking trail, buried in forest so dense even satellite images struggled to see it clearly. No one lived there. It had no power, no road access, no signs of human activity in years. The roof sagged in the middle, half covered in moss and fallen branches. One of the windows was broken, glass glittering in the snow like the remnants of a shattered watch face. She had been found just outside the cabin's rear wall, partially obscured beneath layers of pine needles and old snow. Her remains were scattered, but not violently so. No signs of struggle. No evidence of trauma. No indication she had been buried or hidden. Just quiet, methodical decay. Nature had taken her gently, as if the woods themselves had been reluctant to disturb her. Inside the cabin, there was nothing modern. No food, no firewood, no signs of long-term use. But there were traces: a small stack of weathered newspapers in the corner, long faded from the elements. A rusted chair. A cracked porcelain mug with a chipped lip. Someone had been there, once. Maybe her. Maybe not. Investigators found no additional evidence of foul play. No foreign DNA. No fingerprints but her own. No signs that anyone else had occupied the cabin with her. It was as if she had walked there alone, sat down beneath the trees, and waited for the world to forget she'd ever existed. But that answer never sat right. How had a pregnant woman 6 months along, by all accounts already physically strained, traveled that far on foot, into some of the most unforgiving terrain in the region? How had she known where to go? Why hadn't she called for help, left a note, tried to escape whatever fate led her there? The phone found near her body remained uncrackable. Too damaged. Its battery long dead. Specialists tried to extract data, but most of it was lost to time and corrosion. A few corrupted images, a half-saved draft of a message that ended mid-word, no contacts, no location history. Nothing to build a path backward. Her cause of death was listed as undetermined. No wounds, no poison. No evidence of overdose or hypothermia, though exposure remained the most likely. But even that lacked confirmation. It was as if life had simply stopped. The cabin became a quiet place of pilgrimage for a few weeks. Journalists, internet sleuths, curious locals. They came with cameras and notebooks, but they didn't find what they were looking for. Only silence and the brittle hush of the trees. The forest gave up her name, but not her story. There was no villain, no weapon, no final scream. Only a forensic time capsule hidden in the pines. And a young woman, now found, still waiting to be understood. The discovery of the notebook didn't make headlines the way the DNA match had. It was a quiet footnote in an already quiet tragedy, logged in the evidence report somewhere below, scraps of fabric and personal effects. But for those who had followed Emily Marlowe's story, for her family, for the few strangers who had carried her name like a soft burden for over a decade, the notebook was everything. It was found tucked inside the corner of the cabin, beneath a loose floorboard in what used to be the main room. A worn spiral binding held its pages together, the cover bent but intact. Someone, Emily, almost certainly had wrapped it carefully in plastic, like she knew time would try to take it from her. It had worked. The inside pages were still legible, the ink preserved, the pencil lines smudged but not erased. The past, held together by a Ziploc bag in desperation. Page by page, the sketchbook told a story no one could fully explain. There were drawings, dozens of them. Trees rendered in delicate graphite, tall and twisted, some with eyes hidden in their bark. A train, detailed and mechanical, chugging through clouds that didn't look like clouds at all. They looked like smoke, or fog, or something meant to obscure, to erase. She had drawn the train from different angles, one from inside a tunnel, everything ahead of it swallowed in black, another from far above, a lone car dwarfed by cliffs and winding rails. Each sketch felt unfinished, like she had been rushing or afraid she wouldn't have time. Then came the eyes, not human, not quite. Pairs of them, sometimes 3 sets to a page, watching from the trees. They weren't monstrous, just present, patient, wide and unblinking. Some pages were filled with nothing but eyes, no explanation, no notes. And in between the sketches, bits of writing. Short entries, fragmented thoughts. Not full sentences, just phrases, as if her mind had fractured into pieces too heavy to carry all at once. He said, "Wait here. Not supposed to be this long." Still no sound from the tracks. Thought I heard music. Bird won't stop watching. The handwriting changed as the pages went on, more uneven, shaky, at times hard to decipher. Some entries repeated themselves. Train never stops, train never stops, train never stops. One page near the end was entirely blacked out with pen, scribbled over so violently the paper had torn through. Underneath, faint indentations hinted at words that could no longer be recovered. And then, the last page. A simple sketch, the cabin, surrounded by trees. A path leading nowhere, no figure drawn inside. Just the building and the stillness around it. Below the drawing, in small, almost trembling script, just 5 words. Still here, still waiting. That was it. No signature, no goodbye. No one knows how long Emily stayed in that cabin, whether she was left there or fled there, whether she expected rescue or simply needed a place to disappear. But the notebook offered something no investigation ever had a glimpse into her mind after the world lost sight of her. She hadn't vanished like smoke. She had lingered, sketched, remembered, hoped. Even as the forest closed in around her, Emily had left something behind. A message, perhaps, or a memory that refused to fade. The internet has a way of remembering what the world forgets. Long after official investigations have closed and public interest has dulled into dust, there are always those who remain obsessive, meticulous, relentless. They comb through archives, dissect blurry photographs, compare obscure maps to train schedules from years past. To most, they're hobbyists. To some, conspiracy theorists. But every so often, they find something the professionals missed. It started with a username, TunnelGhost92. On a forum dedicated to cold cases and unexplained disappearances, the user posted a theory that, at first, was dismissed like so many others. But it was the details that caught attention. The timestamps, the employee lists, the union grievances quietly filed and quietly ignored. Over the span of 3 long-form posts, TunnelGhost92 laid out what would come to be known as the conductor theory. According to archived train logs and a series of redacted personnel documents obtained through Freedom of Information requests, there was a man assigned to Emily Marlowe's train route that day. His name was Raymond Kessler. He wasn't the lead conductor, which may explain why his name never appeared in the early reports or why passengers struggled to identify him afterward. He was auxiliary staff, what rail companies refer to as relief crew. In other words, someone there, but not officially recorded as being in charge, invisible to the casual observer. What made Kessler interesting wasn't his position, it was what came after. 6 months after Emily disappeared, Kessler stopped showing up for work. No notice, no resignation, no forwarding address. His employment file simply marked as inactive, no contact. Some assumed he had taken early retirement. Others said he was suffering from health issues. But shortly before his disappearance from the system, an internal complaint had been filed against him, an allegation of inappropriate behavior lodged by a female staff member. It never went to court. The report was buried. Then came the detail that shifted the conversation entirely. Kessler's car, a green 1998 Honda Accord, had been found abandoned near a remote access road bordering the Roosevelt National Forest, the same forest where Emily's belongings were later discovered. The report, unearthed by another forum member, had gone unnoticed at the time. The vehicle had been towed and eventually auctioned off, catalogued simply as abandoned private property. No forensic testing had been performed, no connection made. The proximity was too close to ignore. Sleuths pored over the terrain. The access road was known to few, mostly locals and hunters. From the location where Kessler's car had been found, it was just over 6 miles to the abandoned cabin where Emily's name tag and sketchbook had lain hidden for years. The route was treacherous, unmarked, and wild, but walkable for someone who knew the land. The theory began to solidify, not as fact, but as possibility. That Kessler may have known Emily, may have followed her, may have lured her during that blind stretch of tunnel. That he may have taken her, not with force, but with familiarity, a trusted uniform, a kind word, a false promise. And then, just as suddenly, disappeared himself. Some believed he'd fled. Others believed he'd died out there, swallowed by the same silence that had once taken Emily. But no body was ever recovered. No trace of him was found beyond the car. Just another shadow among the trees. The conductor theory remains unproven. A ghost of a man, a gap in the story. But to those still searching for answers, it became more than a theory. It became the face of the question no one wanted to ask out loud. What if she didn't vanish? What if she was taken by someone who was never supposed to be seen? When the story of Emily Marlowe resurfaced, no longer just a name on a forgotten flyer, but now tied to a cabin, a sketchbook, and a rusted name tag pulled from the snow, something shifted. Quietly, then quickly, old wounds reopened. Internet sleuths, reporters, and amateur investigators who had once pored over her story with a mixture of sympathy and futility began to connect dots they hadn't thought to connect before. Not because they hadn't cared, but because there hadn't been a reason to think the line didn't end with Emily. Until now. In the weeks following the confirmation of her remains, a ripple moved through the quiet corners of forums and comment sections. A user from Utah posted a memory his cousin, 22 years old, vanished during a solo trip on a similar train line in 2006. She had boarded in Grand Junction. No one remembered seeing her past the midpoint. Her name was Shannon Park. She was never found. Another user mentioned a woman named Teresa Kane, last seen leaving her shift at a resort in Winter Park in 2011. She was supposed to take the evening train back to Boulder. The ticket was used. She never arrived. Her car was left in the employee lot. A week later, her scarf was found tangled in brambles near the tracks. The police called it a likely accident. No further investigation was conducted. There was also Lynn Tran, reported missing in 2003. She'd been hiking alone near a rural rail crossing, her journal later found tucked into a hollow tree. No signs of foul play. Case closed without fanfare. The names trickled in, not a torrent, but enough to form a current. All women, all alone. All last seen along the same or adjacent train routes running through the central spine of the Rockies. Scattered years apart, never close enough together to raise alarm at the time. No body count, no message, no warning. But with Emily's case reopened, no longer buried under the weight of indifference, people began asking the harder questions. Why were these disappearances never linked? Why were so many of these women labeled voluntary missing? Why were the investigations so brief, the conclusions so ready-made? It wasn't that anyone had hidden the pattern deliberately. It was worse than that. The pattern had simply been ignored. Each case had occurred in a vacuum, handled by different departments, each with limited resources, each assuming that women go missing for personal reasons, bad relationships, mental health, or the desire to escape. The authorities hadn't looked for connection because they hadn't wanted to believe one existed. And perhaps most damning, no one had thought they were important enough to dig deeper. Emily's case changed that. Her face, once lost to time, was now on every headline. Her sketchbook shared online like a sacred text, its final words etched into the consciousness of 1,000 strangers. Still here, still waiting. What if she wasn't the only one? What if the forest and the tunnel and the desolate rails had been swallowing women for longer than anyone dared admit? Suddenly, a ghost story became a reckoning. Not just for the Marlowes, but for every family who'd been told not to hope, for every woman whose absence had been filed away like an inconvenience. Emily had vanished into silence. Now, she was dragging others back out with her. Long before Emily Marlowe became a name spoken in reverence and regret, long before the headlines and the searches and the grainy photographs, there were whispers that lingered along the train tracks like fog in the valleys. They were never written down, not officially. But they were passed between railway workers like heirlooms of unease. Over coffee in crew lounges, over cigarettes behind engine sheds. They were always shared in low voices, with half smiles that never quite reached the eyes. They called it the watcher in the tunnel. A shadow, a presence, a feeling more than a figure. No one ever described it the same way. Some said it looked like a man, tall and narrow, always standing just beyond the reach of the train's headlight, visible for a split second before disappearing into the black. Others said it wasn't a shape at all, just a coldness, a prickle on the back of the neck when you passed a certain point. Mile marker 112, to be exact. A nondescript sign bolted into a pole along the eastbound stretch, easily missed unless you knew to look. Veteran engineers claimed that radios would go dead in that stretch, not just from the tunnel's natural interference, but from something else. Static that pulsed in rhythmic patterns, silence that felt too deliberate. Conductors told stories of doors closing on their own, of lights flickering without explanation, of hearing footsteps echoing from empty cars while passengers slept. None of these reports ever made it into the official logs, because they weren't official. Just old fears kept alive by tradition. Most dismissed it, of course, as superstition, as the human mind trying to fill in blanks during long, monotonous journeys through isolated terrain. But the unease remained, especially at night, when the wind moaned through the mountains and the tunnel swallowed trains whole without apology. It wasn't until after Emily's disappearance that the whispers began to grow louder again. Some of the older staff recalled seeing her on the train, just before it entered the tunnel. One man, who later left the job entirely, said he passed her in the corridor and felt an overwhelming sense that she wasn't alone. She was walking, he said, but it felt like she was being followed, not closely, just near. He said he saw her glance over her shoulder, as if expecting someone to be there. When he turned to look, no one was. After her name resurfaced, after her remains were found, the tunnel earned a new nickname among the crews, the Vanishing Mouth. Some refused to take runs that passed through it. Others made quiet rituals, tapping the window 3 times, humming under their breath, holding onto something metal as the train slipped into the dark. The legend of the Watcher wasn't taken seriously by the public, not really, but stories have weight, even when no one admits it. They sink into the landscape, into the bones of a place. And when enough disappearances stack up along the same forgotten stretch of track, people start to look backward, not just to the victims, but to the stories that were always there, waiting to be heard. Maybe the Watcher was just a metaphor for the fear that grows in quiet places. Or maybe it was something more. Something that had always been watching, always waiting. And if it was real, then Emily Marlowe was not the first it had followed into the dark. And she might not be the last. They gathered in the clearing just before dusk, where the light softened and the trees whispered like mourners passing through the pews of a natural cathedral. The air held that strange, suspended stillness, too quiet for birds, too breathless for wind. It had taken weeks of paperwork and permissions to gain access to the cabin site, but none of that mattered now. What mattered was that they were here. After 13 years of not knowing, the Marlowe family had come to stand where Emily had last been, not to ask questions, but simply to be near her. Maggie Marlowe moved slowly as she stepped through the pine needles and knelt near the spot where the rusted charm had been found. She held a candle in both hands, the flames small but stubborn against the mountain breeze. Her fingers trembled, but she kept it upright, shielding the glow like something sacred. For years, she had lit candles on anniversaries, in bedrooms, in church basements, in front of framed photographs. But this was different. This one burned not for hope, but for recognition. "She never left us," she said softly, her voice cracking in the hush. "We just didn't hear her crying loud enough." No one spoke. There was no need. Grief had settled over the group like snowfall, quiet and indiscriminate. Her sister, Caroline, stood a few feet away, cradling Emily's sketchbook in her arms like it might shatter if held too tightly. The pages had been photocopied, archived, sealed away by authorities. But they'd allowed Caroline to hold the original for this one moment. She opened to the last page. Her voice was gentle as she read aloud. "Still here, still waiting." It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a sob. It was the kind of line you write when you're no longer trying to be found, but just hoping someone remembers to look. Caroline's voice faltered after that, so she stopped. She pressed the notebook to her chest and looked around the clearing as if expecting her sister to step out from behind a tree, laughing, saying this was all a mistake. But the only sound was the faint flicker of the candle. One by one, others placed tokens by the stone where Emily's necklace had been discovered. A stuffed bear from her niece. A Polaroid of Emily in high school, all braces and dimples. A paper crane. And then, finally, the blanket Maggie had crocheted for the baby, that never was worn and sun-faded from years spent folded at the foot of an unused crib. The sun began to fall, staining the woods in tones of amber and sorrow, and still no one moved to leave. It was as if time, once so cruel and elusive, had finally paused long enough for them to grieve in unison. Not with closure, but with presence. Maggie looked up through the trees, her face wet with tears she didn't bother to wipe away. "We found her," she whispered. "That's what matters now. We found her." For the first time in over a decade, the Marlowe family wasn't lighting a candle in absence. They were lighting it for her. And in the stillness that followed, no bird sang. But the silence, for once, did not feel empty. It felt like her, like Emily. Still here. Still waiting. Still loved. The survey teams moved methodically through the forest in the days following the vigil. They brought dogs, drones, ground-penetrating radar, everything modern law enforcement had to offer. The area around the abandoned cabin was marked out in concentric circles, each inch combed for missed clues, for hidden remains, for signs of others who might have come and gone unseen. Snowmelt turned the earth soft and treacherous underfoot, and the trees, thick and ancient, stood as mute witnesses to the effort. But the forest gave nothing more. No new evidence, no additional remains, no footprints, no artifacts, no hidden caches or signs of shelter beyond what had already been found. The rusted charm, the broken phone, the sketchbook. That was it. That was all the forest had decided to give up, like a reluctant host showing guests only the front room of a house full of locked doors. Despite the thoroughness of the search, the unease remained. There was something about the scene that continued to trouble the investigators, a sense of incompletion that they couldn't put into words. It wasn't just the lack of resolution, it was the wrongness of the stillness. The absence of trace, as if Emily had stepped into that place, and the world had done its best to erase her presence without fully succeeding. As if someone or something had tried to close the book, but left the last page fluttering open. The lead investigator, a woman who'd seen her share of cold cases, made the decision to reclassify the case. After 13 years of being filed under missing adult, no suspicious circumstances, Emily Marlowe's file was finally stamped with something different. Open. Not because of new suspects, not because of conclusive evidence of foul play, but because too many questions refused to be buried. Why had she left the train, and how? If she'd been lured, there was no proof. If she'd fled, there was no trail. How had she survived, even briefly, in that remote place with no supplies? Who brought her there? Had she been alone? The cabin had no records of ownership, no recent activity on satellite images, no human trace beyond Emily's own. Its very existence seemed to hang in the air like an unanswered riddle. There were theories, of course, dozens. The forums were alive again, pulling apart every thread, every map, every timeline. Some clung to the conductor theory, pointing to missing personnel files and the abandoned car. Others leaned into darker possibilities: ritual, isolation experiments, cult activity. One theory even posited that Emily had left clues in her sketches, that the eyes in the trees weren't symbolic but observational, placed deliberately. But for the investigators, theories meant little without evidence. They closed their boxes, packed their equipment, and left the forest behind. But not entirely. Because something had shifted. Emily's story had re-entered the bloodstream of the public. Her face was known again. Her name spoken in living rooms, on message boards, around fire pits, where people asked each other, in hushed voices, if they remembered the woman who vanished on a moving train and was found a lifetime later. Silent and waiting beneath the trees. Her case remains open, her truth remains hidden. What was left behind was more than items in the dirt. It was the ache of not knowing. It was the story unfinished. It was the sense that someone, somewhere, still knew more than they were saying. There is something sacred in remembering. Not the kind that comes from headlines or fleeting attention, but the deeper kind, the remembering that stitches a name back into the fabric of the world. That's what Emily Marlowe's story became in the end. Not a solved mystery, not a closed case, but a memory restored, a presence reasserted, a ghost no longer ignored. 13 years ago, she vanished between two train stations, her life seemingly absorbed by a gap in the map, a stretch of tunnel and trees where even time grew uncertain. For a long while, the world moved on without her. Her name faded. Her face, once printed on flyers and pinned to telephone poles, curled and yellowed in forgotten drawers. Her disappearance became one of those stories people mention in passing, their voices low with resignation. A sad thing, a strange thing, but not a thing they carried. And yet, she lingered. In her mother's rituals, in her sister's sleepless nights, in the digital corners of the internet, where strangers became archivists, obsessed not with spectacle but with truth. Emily was never truly gone, just misplaced in a world too impatient for quiet mysteries. Now, she is found not whole, not explained, but found. The cabin remains, slumping into the earth, a monument not to death, but to waiting. The sketchbook, preserved in ink and trembling lines, lives on in both evidence lockers and hearts. It is studied like scripture by those who see in its drawings not madness, but message. A testimony from a young woman who endured the dark long enough to leave behind a final whisper. Still here, still waiting. Her story reawakened others. Names that had once been dismissed resurfaced. Files were reopened. Families revisited the ache they'd tried to silence. The pattern, once scattered and invisible, began to take shape. Whether Emily was the first or simply the one who could no longer be ignored, she became the thread pulling the veil back. But the forest keeps its secrets. So does the train. It still runs through the mountains, through the valley, through the long hush of Moffat Tunnel. Tourists board, eyes wide at the promise of beauty. Conductors check tickets. Snow clings to the edges of the rails. Somewhere around mile marker 112, the light dims. Phones lose signal, conversations pause. And for a moment, everything feels like it's holding its breath. They say the ride is beautiful, unforgettable. But some whisper about the other thing, the sense that someone else is there. Watching, waiting. Or maybe it's just the weight of memory pressing in from the walls. Because now, they know, now, they remember. Emily Marlowe didn't disappear into nothing. She was taken from view, but not from existence. Her name has been written back into the record. Her face returned to the light. She is no longer a cold case in a drawer or a footnote in an unsolved list. She is a voice that was almost lost, now echoing through the trees. Not all who vanish are gone. Some remain. In sketches. In silence. In the turning of wheels on distant tracks. The train still runs. But now, it does so with a name carried in its shadows.